If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. Your support helps us share more amazing stories, stories that don't just entertain but linger, stories that sit beside you long after the screen fades to black. Before this story truly begins, pause for just a moment. If you believe that stories can quietly reshape the way we understand ourselves, if you believe that the smallest decisions can echo louder than the loudest mistakes, then stay with me until the very end. Because this isn't a story about scandal. It isn't a story about shock. It's a story about something far more unsettling. It's about how one ordinary night, so ordinary it barely deserved attention, became the beginning of something I still struggle to name. People often assume regret is immediate. They think it crashes into you the second you cross a line. That it's loud, obvious, dramatic. But regret isn't like that. Regret is patient. It doesn't knock the moment you make a questionable choice. It waits. It gives you time to believe you're safe. It lets you tell yourself nothing significant happened. And then, when the house is quiet, when the lights are off, when the world has nothing left to distract you from your own thoughts, that's when it begins to speak. And when it does, it doesn't shout. It whispers. For me, it didn't begin with an argument. There were no raised voices. No slammed doors. No dramatic confessions. It began on a Tuesday. Just a Tuesday. The kind of day that looks identical to every other day before it. The kind you would forget entirely, if it hadn't changed everything. That morning my husband, Michael, left early for a business trip. Michael was the kind of man who respected time the way some people respect tradition. He moved with precision. His mornings were choreographed down to the minute. Coffee brewed exactly 6 minutes. Suitcase already packed the night before. Phone charger folded neatly into its designated pocket. He kissed my forehead near the door, the gesture gentle but efficient, and promised he would call once he landed. He always called. Then he stepped outside and disappeared into the rhythm of airports, gate numbers, and meeting rooms with cold coffee and bright fluorescent lights. When the door closed behind him, the house shifted. Not dramatically. Not in a way you could point to. But subtly. Like a background sound that had been muted. The house never felt empty when Michael traveled. It felt unfinished. As if one essential note had been removed from a chord, leaving the rest slightly out of harmony. I stood in the kitchen for a moment longer than necessary, listening to the quiet settle. Then I went about my day. Work stretched longer than I intended. Emails multiplied. Conversations blurred. Meetings overlapped. I told myself I'd leave at 5. Then 5:30. Then 6. By the time I finally pulled into the driveway, exhaustion pressed into my shoulders. Not the physical kind, but the mental weight of too many unfinished thoughts. All I wanted was silence. Warm food. A shower. Sleep. Nothing complicated. Nothing emotional. But the moment I stepped inside, something felt wrong. At first, it was subtle. The lights were where they should be. The living room looked untouched. My purse slipped from my shoulder and landed on the console table with its usual soft thud. And then I heard it. Water. Not rushing. Not spilling. Just a steady, quiet stream drifting down from upstairs. My body tensed instantly. Liam. My stepson must have come home early from university. Liam wasn't careless. He wasn't loud. He didn't leave things unfinished. He moved through the house, as though he were trying not to disturb the air itself. After his mother passed away, silence became something he carried carefully, like a coat he refused to take off. That's why the sound unsettled me. It wasn't loud, but it didn't belong. I climbed the stairs slowly, one hand resting lightly against the banister. Each step seemed louder than usual, as if the house itself were amplifying my presence. The hallway light was on. The bathroom door stood slightly open. Steam drifted into the corridor, thin and pale, catching the glow of the overhead fixture. That alone was strange. Liam valued privacy in a way that bordered on ritual. Doors closed. Curtains drawn. Headphones on. An open door was unlike him. And then the water stopped. The silence that followed felt sharper than the sound itself. And that's when I heard it. A sound so quiet I almost convinced myself it wasn't real. A broken inhale. A softy, soufflet sobe. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just the fragile sound of someone trying desperately not to be heard. I froze. Liam. I whispered. No answer. Every instinct told me to walk away. To respect the boundary. To pretend I hadn't heard anything. But concern has a way of ignoring logic. I knocked once softly. Then gently, I pushed the door open. He was sitting on the bathroom floor. Fully dressed. His back pressed against the cold tile wall. His knees pulled up to his chest, arms wrapped tightly around himself as if he were holding something inside, something threatening to spill. His shoulders trembled, not violently, but just enough to betray how hard he was fighting. His eyes were red. His hands shook when he wiped his face. I'm fine, he said quickly. But his voice cracked halfway through. Thin. Uneven. I didn't step closer. I didn't touch him. Instead, I lowered myself onto the floor a few feet away. Slowly. Carefully. Like approaching something already fragile. Silence stretched between us. Not awkward. Just heavy. You don't have to be fine, I said quietly. What's going on? He stared at the floor. For a long moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. Then barely above a whisper he spoke. I don't know what's wrong with me anymore. The words landed harder than I expected. I can't sleep, he continued. I can't focus. I feel like I'm slipping away from myself. This wasn't teenage frustration. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't anger. It was fear. Raw. Quiet. Unprotected. Since his mother's death, grief had lived in this house like an unspoken rule. It was never addressed directly. Never named. But it shaped everything. The pauses in conversation. The way Michael avoided certain photographs. The careful politeness Liam and I maintained around one another. Grief sat at the dinner table with us. It lingered in doorways. It echoed in empty rooms. And now here it was, no longer silent. I wanted to reach out. The instinct was immediate. Human. To steady him. To soften the edges of whatever was tearing through him. But my hand hesitated. There's a line. A thin, almost invisible line between support and closeness. Between care and dependence. Between helping someone through their pain. And becoming the only place they feel safe from it. And in that moment, I realized how easily that line could blur. You're not broken, I said softly. You're human. And you've been carrying too much for too long. He looked up at me then. Not confidently. Not defiantly. But searching. As if my face held something he desperately needed to find. Do you really think it gets better? He asked. The question wasn't hopeful. It was a plea. I do, I said. And I think part of you already knows that. He swallowed. The silence returned. But it felt different now. Less suffocating. More fragile. When I finally stood and stepped out of the bathroom, the hallway felt heavier. As though something invisible had shifted. Sleep didn't come easily that night. The house was quiet, but not peaceful. There's a difference. Peace feels settled. This felt like waiting. I lay awake replaying his expression. The way his eyes lingered a fraction too long. The way his voice softened when I told him he wasn't broken. And somewhere between midnight and morning, I realized something. Something had begun. Not a mistake. Not yet. But something delicate. Something unnamed. And once you step into something like that, even unintentionally, there's no stepping back out unchanged. The next morning, the house carried a different kind of quiet. Not heavy. Not tense. Just aware. I found Liam in the kitchen before I left for work. He was standing by the counter, staring into a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. Morning, I said gently. He glanced up, hesitant. Morning. There was a brief pause, one that held the memory of the night before. I'm glad you knocked, he said quietly. It was a simple sentence, but it felt significant. I'm glad you let me, I replied. That could have been the end of it. Just a moment of connection. A step toward healing. But healing, I would learn, can sometimes create its own complications. Because when someone feels seen after a long period of invisibility, they don't forget who saw them. Over the next few days, something subtle began to change. He lingered in rooms I was in. He asked small questions. Harmless ones. About work. About books I was reading. About whether I thought certain movies were overrated. ordinary conversations. But beneath them was something quieter. Trust. And trust, when placed carefully, is beautiful. But when misplaced, it can become something else entirely. I told myself I was helping. That this was what adults do. What step-parents are supposed to do. Offer stability. Offer listening. And maybe that was true. But late at night, when the house went quiet again, I found myself replaying moments. Not because they were inappropriate, but because they felt important. And importance has weight. Michael called each evening from whichever city he happened to be in. Hotel room in the background. Suit jacket draped over a chair. "How's everything at home?" he'd ask. "Quiet," I'd reply. And it was true. It was quiet. But quiet doesn't always mean simple. A week later, Liam knocked on my study door. "Do you have a minute?" I looked up from my laptop. "Of course." He stepped inside, hesitant but determined. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began. "About not being broken." I closed the screen. "I don't think I've let myself talk about her," he admitted. The word hung between us. Her. His mother. Grief, when ignored, doesn't disappear. It condenses. It settles into corners. It builds pressure. And pressure eventually needs somewhere to go. So we talked. About her laugh. About the way she used to hum while cooking. About how angry he felt at himself for forgetting the exact sound of her voice. I listened. And as I listened, I felt that line again. That thin boundary between being supportive and becoming essential. Because when someone opens a door that vulnerable, you don't just step inside. You leave footprints. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment where everything tilted. It was gradual. Like water slowly reshaping stone. He began texting occasionally during the day. Small updates. "Exam went okay. Didn't sleep much. Thinking about what you said." I responded thoughtfully, carefully, but I responded. And every response built something. Not visible, but real. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't immediately name. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't inappropriate. But it wasn't purely familial either. It was recognition. The kind that says, "You understand me in a way others don't." And that's where danger begins. Not in obvious betrayal, but in emotional exclusivity. I began to notice the way I adjusted my tone around him. Softer. More patient. More attentive than I sometimes was with Michael after long days. That realization unsettled me. Because care should not feel selective. And yet it was. Not intentionally, but undeniably. One night, long after Michael had returned from his trip, I lay awake again. The house silent. Michael asleep beside me. And I asked myself a question I wasn't ready to answer. When does helping someone cross the line into needing to be needed? Because being needed is powerful. It fills quiet spaces. It gives purpose. It makes you feel irreplaceable. And that's where regret truly begins. Not with an action, but with a shift. A shift in attention. A shift in emotional gravity. A shift so small you barely feel it, until you do. Looking back now, I don't mark the beginning by the night in the bathroom. I mark it by the moment I realized I looked forward to our conversations. By the subtle disappointment when he didn't text. By the way my thoughts lingered just a little too long. Nothing inappropriate happened. No boundaries were visibly broken. But something internal moved. And once something moves inside you, once it rearranges your priorities even slightly, you can't pretend it hasn't. Regret doesn't begin with scandal. It begins with silence. With shared vulnerability. With moments that feel meaningful in ways you can't immediately justify. And the most dangerous part? They don't feel wrong. They feel human. They feel compassionate. They feel necessary. Until one day, you realize that an ordinary Tuesday became the starting point of something far more complicated than you ever intended. And by then, the whisper of regret has already begun.